Hello, and thanks for joining us. I'm Shannon Sand, an agricultural economist and extension educator with the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Center for Ag Profitability and one of the hosts of Ag Smart Money Week. CAP hosts regular webinars most Thursdays at noon Central Time. Find the schedule of upcoming webinars as well as the archive of every recording on our center's website, cap.unl.edu. Today, we are excited to focus on the checkbook register. Though many of us carry a checkbook register, we probably are not maintaining it properly. Simple steps can improve the usefulness of this everyday tool. To present, we are joined by Jessica Groskopf, a regional agricultural economics extension educator located in Scottsbluff. Jessica, thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Shannon, and thanks to everybody who is with us today. I would really encourage you, if you have questions throughout today's event, you are welcome to use the chat feature or the Q&A feature to ask those questions. So let me get a screen shared here and everything settled. So as Shannon said, I'm located in Scottsbluff, and what I do is I work with farmers and ranchers on the business side of their operation. And for the last, almost 5 years, we've been working on financial management and financial planning. And through this process, I've learned a lot about people's checkbooks and particularly their checkbook register. So today is just going to go over, like Shannon said, some of those tips and tricks to make sure that we're managing it properly. So the first question is, where do you get a checkbook register? And traditionally, these come with your check. So when you order a new set of checks, there should be a checkbook register in there. You can also pick one up at your local bank. They should provide that for free. You can order them online, or you can create one in Excel. But having a checkbook register is really important. And what it does is it provides you with a real-time record of your account balance. And I know we live in the digital age where, most of the time people will pull up their bank account on their phone. But the reality is in agriculture is that we probably write more checks than the general population. And so being able to know, what your actual balance is really, really important, because your account only reflects what the bank has processed, not the checks that you have written or the deposits that you have made. So the first step of your checkbook is entering and balancing your checkbook. And this is what most of us think of. So how do we enter and balance? So we have to think about all the transactions that we will incur throughout our life, right? And so a transaction is the instance of buying or selling something. But I also think that this should be expanded to discuss any withdrawals or deposits into that account. And the ones that we miss the most are things like fees or interest accrual, those kinds of things. So we need to make sure we're not only just recording in our checkbook register when we wrote a check or when we deposited money, but it also needs to reflect those other items. So most people are familiar with a one-line checkbook register system. And so I'm going to go through that system. So when you get a checkbook, the first thing that you're going to do is you're going to put in your beginning account balance up there in the top. Usually it's in the right hand at the top line there. Then you'll see that there are columns across that allow you to put in the check number or code, and I'll talk about those here in a little bit. The date of the transaction description, and then typically it goes that you have the debits on the left and the deposits on the right, and then you'll calculate what your new balance is. So this is what this looks like. So for example, on June 29th, I wrote check number 233 to the local farm store. I paid $8,933. So I'm going to, because it's a debit, I made a payment. I'm going to subtract that from the account balance. So that brings me down to $47,999.90. So this is the typical process that we work through. So again, make sure that your balance is correct. There's no point in having a checkbook if you are not recording and tracking that balance. You could argue that it's, a duplication of records. But the reality is the purpose of this is to know the actual ending balance in your bank account. So making sure that you actually calculate that balance out every time. Now, sometimes we have things that, like I said before, like deposits and withdrawals that don't have necessarily a check number associated with them. So you're going to use some sort of a code. And I typically like to see folks match their codes to whatever their bank uses for those transactions. So you might see an AD, which is an automatic deposit. Another one that I see a lot more happening is electronic funds transfer. So again, a physical check was never written. They just electronically moved dollars around. So you can use these to identify how those transactions occurred, especially if you're using something like a debit card. I think this is really important because it's automatically showing up in that account, and you need to make sure that those transactions are recorded. So again, often automatic deposits like interest payments or withdrawals like service fees are omitted from the checkbook register. And I think it's really, really important that you take the time and make sure that you record these types of transactions. So here's another example, and this time I'm going to use a code as we write out into our checkbook register. So this time I had a deposit on the same date to my bank for the amount of $10,000, and then I recalculated that ending balance. So this time, because it was a deposit, I'm going to add that to there. So one of the things that's interesting, and again, in agriculture, we probably write more checks than other people, is that sometimes I'll write a check and it won't immediately post to my bank, or I'll make a deposit and it won't show up right away. So what we need to track next is when that check clears the bank or when that deposit posts to my account. So in the middle between the payment and the deposit, there's usually it's a really narrow column. Most people just put a check mark in it. You might see a C for cleared there as well, but we need to denote when that transaction is cleared. So we need to make sure that we do that and we're tracking that information. And this is where it gets really important. An unrecorded credit means that your check register will overstate your balance. An unrecorded debit means that it will overstate your balance. So we need to make sure, number one, that we're doing it, and number two, that when they have actually cleared, we have that information available. So again, here's just that column where we're denoting whether or not that transaction has cleared or not. So one line check register system, I think, is perfectly acceptable. But let's say that I'm in a business and this is our primary source of information. This is for a lack of a better term, the ledger of account for our business. There's not a whole lot of detail here related to what I purchased, how much I purchased, those kinds of things. So like, what did I buy for $8,000 at the local farm store? So one thing that might help or add some additional detail would be actually moving to a 2-line transaction system that provides more detail or more information. Now, there's kind of 2 different ways that you can do this. I actually prefer, in my opinion, the top way. But if you are helping young adults or children learn about how to balance their checkbook, you might look at that bottom one. So the process is pretty much the same when we talk about entering that top line. So still going to utilize those columns, number, date, payee name, and the amount of the debit or credit, and we're going to calculate a balance. The cool part is on the line immediately below that, we're also potentially going to record the tax category or the memo line. Okay. The difference here is when we get into what we're doing in that balance column. In the top one, we're just going to make that calculation and recalculate that new balance on the same line that we did previously. In the bottom one, what we're doing is we're carrying over that debit or credit into the balance line so that it's more of a running tabulation to create that new balance. And again, if you're working with kids or young adults who haven't done this before, I think this can really help them understand the math portion of it, and help them really track that math a little bit better. So here's how that looks, again, with that local farm store. So it's the same transaction we looked at previously, check number 233, where we hit on June 29th. On the top, I just go ahead and calculate that balance, same as I did previously. On the bottom, you see that I will carry over that 8933 over into the balance column. Make sure you, if it's a debit, put a negative in front of it. If it's a deposit, we'll put an add sign in front of it. And then we'll calculate the balance on the next line. So I like a two-line system for multiple reasons, but the main reason is just having that additional detail. So if I have one person in my operation who is doing the purchasing and another person who's maybe doing the reconciling or categorizing that information for tax purposes, I now can look at the checkbook register and quickly know, okay, on June 29th, we bought supplies, right? And that was for fencing. We could also do this. It can also be really helpful when we enter that memo line with a little bit more detail. So let's say this time it was a deposit. And in that deposit, I could say, 1,000 bushels of corn at whatever price. So you're just adding that detail again, making it easier. I don't have to go back to whoever the purchaser was and ask what that was or go dig out the receipt. I have a lot of that information available. So again, I like the two-line system just for adding that type of information, making sure that by having more information, especially if there's two parties or I'm trying to teach someone about our operation, that they can learn a lot from when they see our checkbook register. So entering transactions into the checkbook register is probably the easy part. The next step in the process is reconciling the checkbook register to your bank account and potentially to any financial software that you have. I have a whole article online. You can scan the QR code there, and it goes kind of step by step through the reconciliation process. And so that's a good resource for you to have and use. So what is reconciling? Reconciling is the process of making sure that one record of financial account is consistent with another. Okay. So in this scenario, we're just going to be looking at the top two there, which is the bank statement and the checkbook register. But if you're like most farming and ranching operations, you probably also have a financial software. So this process, I think, is something that if you want to improve your financial record keeping, is absolutely the thing that you should be doing. Okay. So today I'm just going to walk through those top two, but know that this is a process that should be done for any financial record that's out there. So we need to do this on a monthly basis. And here's how the process goes. What we need to do is we need to compare our receipts and our invoices to our bank statements. So that's number one. Is everything recorded properly according to the bank, right? Again, it gets more complicated if you also have a credit card, but in this instance, we're going to say that everything kind of runs through your bank. So compare receipts and invoices to the bank statements, make sure there aren't any errors on the bank statement. If there is an error on the bank statement, you need to contact your bank at this point. We're going to do that process again. We're going to compare the receipts and invoices to the checkbook register. Okay. One thing I like to do, and this is where my checkbook register maybe gets a little bit messy, is I also like to check that the amount was correct and then I calculated it properly, right? So again, just going back, checking that math, making sure the items are correct. So again, this step is comparing those receipts and invoices to then that checkbook register where I'll check my math. Okay. Then the last part of the process is comparing the bank statements to the checkbook register and looking for uncleared checks and uncleared deposits. And we're going to record these uncleared checks and uncleared deposits on what we call a reconciliation worksheet, which I'll show you here in just a little bit. So those outstanding transactions, again, make it so that our bank statement is under or overstating our true balance. And so we want to make sure that we fully recognize what that amount is. Okay. So this is the process where I then use that column between the debit and the credit column. I use that little check mark column to make sure that it's cleared. Okay. So at the end of this process, what you really want to have happen is a point where the bank statements equal the reconciliation worksheet. Okay, let me say that again. The bank statements equal the reconciliation worksheet. So I'm going to pause here. I'm going to stop my share and reshare a different screen so you can look at what that bank statement reconciliation looks like. So give me just a second. So this is what that reconciliation worksheet looks like. So at the top, and it's probably less common to have uncleared deposits, but if I happen to, right, I'm going to post any uncleared deposits here at the top of the sheet. I'm going to total those up. And then I'm going to record any uncleared checks and total those up. So then what I will do, and the important box is down here on the bottom right, I will write in the beginning bank balance, right? What the bank statement says my balance is, add up all my total uncleared deposits and enter those in the second area. And then I'll subtract off the uncleared checks to get that adjusted bank balance. And again, the ultimate goal here is to have that reconciliation worksheet be equal to my checkbook register. Okay. So that's what we're really aiming for as we go through this process, is knowing that we have accounted for all of those transactions and that both the bank and the checkbook register are correct. And we need to do this on a monthly basis. Tina Barrett with Nebraska Farm Business has a great story of a feedlot that had wrote a check that was uncleared, but the bank kept saying it was processed, and it was processed on somebody else's account. And so it was okay for the feedlot, right? But it definitely wasn't for whoever's account it was posted to. And I can't imagine that kind of an error, especially with the size of checks that feedlots are writing, but that's what it comes down to. The other thing about that is when the bank finally corrected it, what would have happened if that feedlot had overspent on their account? Because when that check finally clears, that could be $10,000 or $20,000 or more actually coming out of their account. So knowing that true bank balance by going through the process and recording those transactions properly in a checkbook register and reconciling that account on a regular basis is the best way to catch mistakes and the best way to improve your record keeping system. So let me kick back up the PowerPoint here for today and reshare screen. So again, just to reiterate, the hope here is that the banks that you're working through this process and you get these to be equivalent to one another. Okay, so where do I get a reconciliation worksheet? Actually, typically, especially if you have a business account, that reconciliation worksheet is printed on the back page of your bank statement. My bank prints them on the back of the first page. Okay, so you should be filing that with your bank statement so that you know what's going on. You can create one in Excel, or you can download the one that I showed you online using the QR code on the screen or going to that go.unl URL there on the screen. So let's go through an example, okay? Because I think sometimes this is one of those things that needs a little bit of practice. So I have a couple here, and they received their June bank statement, and the bank statement says the balance is $56,776, but the checkbook register says the balance is $57,999.90, right? So this is what we're talking about. We have a discrepancy between what the bank is saying is in the account and what the checkbook register is saying the account. So they're going to go through the process of reconciling and make sure that everything is okay. So they found these 6 discrepancies. And what we're going to do is identify whether that's something that should be recorded in the checkbook register or whether that should be recorded on a reconciliation worksheet. So the first one is that someone incorrectly recorded a deposit. So they missed 10 cents. Okay. So on that one, if I incorrectly recorded a deposit in the checkbook register, I'm going to need to make a correction in the checkbook register for that 10 cents. The bank statement shows a service charge, and it also shows interest income. So that's number 2 and 3. This is an instance where those also need to be recorded in the checkbook register. Okay, so all 1, 2, and 3 are corrections I'm making in the checkbook register. Okay. When we get to number 4, we wrote a check that hasn't cleared the bank. Okay, so that's going to go on our reconciliation worksheet, and that's the same as number 5. They had a deposit that hasn't appeared on the bank statement. Okay, so 4 and 5 are going to go on the reconciliation worksheet. The last one is an automatic clearinghouse payment for electricity that was paid from the bank account. Okay, so this is like an electronic funds transfer. They happen to call it an ACH. So that's something that's going to have to be recorded in the checkbook register. So just to review, everything but 4 and 5 are going to be corrections to a checkbook register. Okay. So this is what we're going to do. We're going to go through and make these comparisons. So let's walk through what this looks like in terms of writing it out on the reconciliation worksheet. So I'm going to start with my ending bank balance. Okay, so I'm going to write that as my first line. I'm going to add in my uncleared deposits and then subtract off my uncleared checks. Okay. If you build, let's say, an Excel file to do this for you, make sure you add before you subtract in this scenario. Okay. Make sure you get that order of operations correct. Okay. So the adjusted bank balance here, by the time we add in the uncleared deposit and subtract off the uncleared check, is $57,843. Okay. So what do those corrections look like on my check register? So I'm going to go ahead and put in that correction on the 10 cents for the deposit. And then we've got the service fee and the income. Okay. And finally, we'll record that ACH. And notice the balance on the reconciliation worksheet and the balance on the checkbook register now equal one another. Okay. So this is part of that process. We really want to make sure that we get the reconciliation worksheet and the checkbook register to balance. So most common things that I see is that we probably have or might have some uncleared checks, and we're not recording those fees or automatic transfers or debit card transactions that are coming out of the bank account. Okay. It's very unlikely that I'm going to have an uncleared deposit. So that's something that I rarely see, but it's possible. Okay. So just a few other tips and tricks as we talk about financial management. I think it's really important. A lot of us are keeping financial records, frankly, for taxes. And I would like to point out that credit card statements and bank statements are not enough to prove to the IRS your your expense was tax deductible. Okay, so for expenses, they need to not only identify the payee and the amount paid and the proof of payment, they also need to include a description of the item that was purchased. So I need to have both the check, which is basically my proof of payment, and also an invoice or a receipt that outlines that description of that item that was purchased. On the revenue side, it does ask for those kinds of details as well. So there's no way, in my opinion, to get rid of receipts and invoices. You're going to have to figure out how to manage those. When we're talking about checks, I think one thing that can happen is that they're posted to the wrong account. So make sure that you write an invoice number or a vendor account number on your checks. So like when I get a bill from the co-op, it will have like, a co-op member ID number, or it'll have an invoice number. I make sure that I also write that on my check. You can write that either under your address block, or you can write it in the memo, are probably the two places that someone will look for that type of information. But help them out, right? Make sure that those are getting posted to the proper account. I really like to use duplicate checks and deposit slips, or I like my bank to print an image of those checks on my statement. Again, just having that proof of payment, and then also being able to read that carbon copy sometimes can be difficult. So just having either those duplicate checks or having them print them on your statement can be really, really helpful. The other thing is to use security envelopes. The reality is that identity theft is real, and having envelopes that you can hold up to the light and read bank account numbers off of is probably not the best. So make sure when you're selecting envelopes to send checks in, that they have that little kind of cross-hatched printed pattern on the inside. I don't know how much people actually do that, but I think it's a simple step for a few more cents to be a little bit more secure. And finally, if you're utilizing a software, I really like to eliminate some of that duplication. So why not have your software print your checks? Whether it's QuickBooks, Quicken, a lot of these softwares now make it to where you can enter that information and print out a nice check that also has then a record with the tearaway piece that shows exactly what that was for. So might help in some of this reconciling process by eliminating handwritten checks. Depends on your operation, but it is something that is possible. So I know that was a really quick session, but I will hang on and am happy to answer any questions that you might have. So if you have any questions, if you want to throw those in the chat or in the Q&A, I am happy to answer those.
So I'll ask a question, Jessica. Because when you first started at the beginning of the presentation, it was a lot of like handwriting and like the checkbook register, but are there like apps or something that like people can use that are helpful? Or I'm lazy. If I can do it on my phone is always with me. I mean, I can even pay for stuff with it now, supposedly. I haven't quite figured it out other than Starbucks, but
yeah, so
yeah.
There are apps that are available that are associated with the software. The problem is if you have a handwritten check that you sent, right, that app is not going to reflect that unposted, undeposited check. So if you have that scenario, you need to have some sort of record of the checks that you've written and whether or not that they have cleared. You can eliminate handwritten checks. That's absolutely possible. but that doesn't eliminate the fact that some of them will still remain uncleared. So when I use a software like Quicken, it's going to show me that check has not cleared the bank. So those softwares usually still have a reconciliation feature that you still must do manually. So I think you have to do what's right for you, and software can simplify the process, but it does not eliminate the fact that you might have uncleared checks or uncleared deposits.
Okay. And then we did get a question. When making a correction for an error that had been made before on the check register, is it better to make another entry into the check register, or can you just cross it out on the error and correct it up above in the check register?
Depends on how long ago the error was. My preference is to create a correction entry and then correct the balance at the end, because otherwise I'm correcting if I have calculated my balance, right? I'm correcting every single balance after that error all the way down. Where if I see the error, I can make the correction entry and hopefully I get to the proper balance at the end. So that's my preference. But again, it depends on, was it 10 transactions ago or was it 3 transactions ago? I think that would change it. And then did I write it in pen or did I write it in pencil so I can erase?
I only have pens with me, so at least for me, it would be a pen. So.
Yeah. Yeah, but that's a great question. That's a great question to ask. Well, I would just encourage everyone, and if especially as we come into tax prep season and the end of the year, it takes practice. It takes practice to keep your checkbook register up to date. It takes practice to make sure that you get all your receipts and invoices actually in, so you can do the reconciling process. And it's just a good first step into getting prepared for those tax meetings and knowing what you spent and what you haven't. So I encourage you, don't get bogged down in the holidays. Don't get bogged down in harvest. Make sure you keep your financial records up to date, because once we get to the end of December, it's going to be scramble time for those pre-tax meetings. Cool. Well, thank you so much for having me today, Shannon.
Yes, thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you to everyone for joining us today. A recording of this webinar will be posted at cap.unl.edu, where you can register for all the other upcoming webinars and things we have going on. We would also really appreciate your feedback on a brief evaluation that hopefully should pop up as soon as you close out of Zoom. That helps tell us how today went and to inform us of future webinars and programs you'd like to see. Thank you again for joining us.